Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The reunion was always a haunted affair, a gathering of ghosts in the pleasant disguise of a backyard barbecue. The air thick with the smell of charcoal and the cloying sweetness of baked beans. A facade of normalcy plastered over a foundation of quiet, unspoken grief that had calcified over 3 decades. A grief I never fully understood because I was only 7 years old the last time I saw my cousin Liam, a boy with hair the color of wheat and a laugh that sounded like a sudden happy seizure, a memory so polished by time and retelling that it felt more like a story I'd been told than something I'd actually lived. The official story being that he had drowned in the lake at the old Miller's Pond campground on the final night of our family trip. A tragic accident that stole a golden boy and cast a perpetual, gentle shadow over our clan, a shadow we'd learned to live with. A sad but tidy ending to a life that had become more of a relic than a reality. This year, the reunion was at my Aunt Carol's sprawling, creaky Victorian, a house that had always felt like a living entity with its groaning floorboards and the way it held the heat of the day long into the cool summer night. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the adults, fueled by a few too many beers and a desperate, middle-aged need to recapture some shred of reckless youth, decided it would be a grand idea to break out the Ouija board. My teenage daughter had left in the hall closet, a cheap piece of cardboard and plastic that suddenly seemed to carry the weight of a tombstone as we gathered around the heavy oak table in the dimly lit den, the mood shifting from jovial nostalgia to a tense, giggly anticipation. I was one of the first to place my fingers on the planchette, its plastic heart-shaped window feeling absurdly flimsy. My cousin Sarah on one side with her eyes already wide with a performative fear, and my brother Mark on the other, his smirk barely concealing a nervousness I knew all too well. And as we asked the obligatory, silly questions, "Is anyone there? What's your name?" The planchette moved with a lazy, unconvincing sluggishness that we all pretended not to be directing, until a sudden chill, inexplicable and sharp, swept through the room like an exhale from the walls themselves, and the playful pushes ceased, replaced by a genuine, unseen force that made the little triangle jerk under our fingertips with a purpose that was terrifyingly alien. The first word it spelled was fire, the planchette slamming from letter to letter with a violent certainty that made Sarah gasp and pull her hand back for a second before forcing herself to return, her knuckles white, and we all exchanged looks, a silent agreement passing between us that this was no longer a game, the air growing heavy and cold enough that I could see the faint mist of my own breath, a detail that seemed impossible in the stifling August night. Then it spelled camp, and a collective, sharp intake of breath circled the table, because everyone of a certain age knew what that meant, the unspoken anniversary that hovered over this very gathering. And my eyes instinctively found Uncle Frank, my father's older brother, who had been the one to pull Liam's small, still body from the water, his face in the lamplight suddenly ashen and ancient, his jaw clenched so tight I thought I could hear his teeth grinding. But the worst was yet to come, the planchette moving again, relentless, a skittering insect of doom spelling out Liam, and the name hung in the frozen air, not as a question but as a statement, an accusation, and the room erupted into a chaos of denied pushes and frantic whispers of who's doing that. But the trembling in our hands was universal, a shared vibration of pure, unadulterated fear, because the truth we all felt in our bones was that none of us were moving it, that something else was in the room with us, something that knew. It was then that the fragmented memories, long buried under the neat story of a drowning, began to surface like bloated corpses from the deep. First in my own mind, a flash of intense heat on my face, the smell of burning nylon, and something else, something sweet and awful, the sound of screaming that wasn't of fun but of pure terror, and the image of Liam not wet and pale from lake water, but his skin flushed red in the flickering light of a massive, uncontrolled blaze. And I saw the same, dawning horror on the faces of my other cousins, Sarah's eyes welling with tears as she whispered, "I remember a fire. I remember running. and Mark staring blankly ahead, muttering. The tent caught fire, and all the while Uncle Frank sat perfectly still, a statue of grief and guilt, his shoulders beginning to shake with silent sobs as the fabricated reality of the last 30 years crumbled around him under the relentless pressure of a truth that a simple board game had somehow unleashed. He didn't so much speak as have the words torn from him, a low, broken groan that escalated into a wail of such profound anguish that it silenced us all. His confession pouring out in a torrent of tears and snot in 3 decades of corrosive silence. The story unfolding not as a ghost story, but as a story of human failure and desperate, misguided love. How on that last night, the adults had been drinking around the main campfire, while we kids played a game of tag in the nearby woods. How Liam, being the boldest, had dared to sneak back and grab a burning branch to light a smaller, secret fire for us, a big kid fire. How his sleeve had caught. How the panic had sent him stumbling backwards into the dry canvas of our tent, which went up in an instant, a tower of flame that consumed him in a matter of seconds, and how Uncle Frank, hearing our screams, had been the first to arrive, beating out the flames with his bare hands. Hands that were still scarred, he revealed, holding them up. For us to see in the dim light, twisted and shiny, a testament he had hidden for our sake. He told us how, in the hysterical aftermath, with all of us children witnessing the charred, unspeakable horror, he made the split-second decision to spare us, to create a cleaner, kinder ghost, carrying Liam's body to the lake and soaking it, inventing the story of a tragic drowning, a story everyone latched onto because the truth was too monstrous to bear, a secret so heavy it had bound the family together in a web of lies, a poison that had seeped into our foundations and shaped our relationships, our anxieties, our very personalities, all to protect us from a trauma that, as it turned out, we had witnessed anyway, only to have it buried alive inside us where it festered, unnamed and unresolved. The aftermath was not one of anger, but of a strange, hollow liberation, a collective exhale after holding our breath for 30 years. The ghost of Liam finally laid to rest not because a spirit was appeased, but because the secret that had given him his false, watery death was finally exposed. And I realized the true horror was never a boy's ghost knocking at the door from the other side, but the living, breathing secret we had all carried, a parasite of guilt and silence that had fed on our family for decades. And as we sat there in the wreckage of our past, the Ouija board just a stupid piece of cardboard again, I understood that the most terrifying hauntings are not the ones that go bump in the night, but the ones we choreograph ourselves in the bright, desperate light of day, the secrets we bury deep and hope to God never find a voice. The silence that followed Uncle Frank's confession was thicker and more absolute than any I had ever known, a physical weight pressing down on the oak table, on our shoulders, on our very lungs, making it hard to draw breath, a silence not of emptiness but of terrible, overwhelming fullness, as if the room, the house, the very night air had been waiting 3 decades for this exhalation of truth and was now satiated and still. And in that cavernous quiet, the memories didn't just trickle back anymore. They broke through the dam of the drowning story in a raging flood, vivid and scorching. The orange and blue of the flame licking up Liam's favorite red flannel shirt, the way he'd spun, a frantic, shrieking top, his arms flailing not in water, but against the unbearable assault of the fire. The sound, God, the sound was a high, thin wail that was more animal than boy. A sound that had been buried so deep in my psyche that its resurfacing felt like a bone being reset, agonizing and necessary, and I saw on the faces of my cousins the same brutal recollection. Sarah now weeping openly, her body shuddering as she remembered clutching my hand, our small fingers intertwined as we watched the nightmare unfold, and Mark, his tough guy facade utterly vaporized, staring at his own hands as if he could still see the soot from that night under his nails. We were no longer a group of middle-aged relatives at a reunion. We were a circle of traumatized children, reunited not by choice, but by a shared, suppressed horror that had just been given its true name. And the ghost we had been communing with wasn't Liam at all, but the ghost of that moment, the ghost of the lie, a phantom that had been whispering its version of events for so long that we had mistaken its voice for memory itself. The focus wasn't on blame, not really. It was on the staggering, heartbreaking weight of Uncle Frank's sacrifice, the burden he had shouldered alone, burning his hands on the truth both literally and figuratively, crafting a narrative of a peaceful drowning to spare our young minds from the visceral horror of combustion. From the smell of burnt flesh and melting synthetic fabric that I now realized had haunted my dreams for years in the form of vague, smoky anxieties and a deep-seated fear of campfires. The truth was a liberation, but it was a brutal one, like having a limb that had been set incorrectly broken again so it could heal properly. And the grief that washed over us was fresh and raw, a 30-year-old wound suddenly exposed to the air, and we were mourning Liam all over again. But this time we were mourning the true tragedy of his death, the chaotic, violent accident, and we were also mourning the lost years, the conversations about him that had always been hushed and sanitized, the way his name had become a sacred, sorrowful relic instead of a trigger for the complex, messy, terrifying memory it should have been. The Ouija board, that cheap conduit, lay inert between us, a stark reminder of how fragile our understanding of reality truly is, how a family's entire history can be built upon a foundation of well-intentioned sand. And I thought about all the other secrets that must live in the walls of old houses like this one. Secrets that hum just below the threshold of hearing, waiting for a foolish game, a careless question, or a crack in the composure of a weary old man to finally spill forth. The reunion ended not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, tearful embraces, a newfound, painful intimacy binding us together, where before there had only been the polite distance of shared but unacknowledged history. And as I drove home through the dark, the night felt different, the world felt different, because the past had been rewritten, and the ghost that had haunted our family had finally been exorcised, not by a priest or a ritual, but by the unbearable, necessary weight of the truth. And I knew that things would never be the same, that our family narrative had been irrevocably altered, and that the haunting was over, replaced by the quieter, more profound and unsettling task of learning how to live with the real story, a story without a ghost, but with a fire that, after 30 years, had finally been put out. The days that followed were a strange, slow-motion avalanche of quiet reckonings, the world outside my window continuing its mundane cycle of sunrises and sunsets, while the internal landscape of my life, of my entire family's history, had been irrevocably scorched and reshaped by Uncle Frank's confession, and I moved through my routines, making coffee, answering emails, driving to the grocery store, with the detached sensation of an actor playing a role, the props of my former life feeling flimsy and insignificant against the weight of the truth that now sat like a stone in my gut. My dreams, once vague tapestries of anxiety, became sharp and specific, replaying the corrected memory of that night with a cruel, cinematic clarity. The crackle of the fire swallowing the sound of our childish laughter, the way the light from the flames danced on Liam's face, not in a friendly campfire story way, but in a demonic flicker that transformed his features into a mask of terror. The smell, always the smell, a pungent mix of pine sap and something horribly organic burning, a senai, now recognized as the core of my lifelong aversion to barbecue smoke and autumn bonfires. I found myself staring at my own children as they played in the backyard, their joyful shrieks sending a jolt of primal fear through me, and I had to physically restrain myself from snatching them up and smothering them in a protective embrace, a reaction born not from the old, abstract fear of water I'd carried since the fictional drowning, but from a new, visceral understanding of how quickly a moment of childhood curiosity could spiral into irreversible catastrophe, the fragility of their little bodies now a terrifying, constant reality. The phone calls with my cousins became a daily ritual, not of gossip but of shared therapy, each conversation peeling back another layer of the onion. As Sarah recalled the recurring nightmare she'd had for years of a red bird chasing her, which she now understood was the flaming shape of Liam, and Mark confessed his inability to ever go camping again, a phobia we'd all attributed to a simple dislike of the outdoors, but now saw as a deep-seated psychological scar from the trauma we'd witnessed and then been forced to forget. We were archaeologists of our own damaged psyches, carefully brushing away the dust of the lie to examine the true fossil of the event beneath. And with each new discovery came a wave of grief for the boy we lost and for the children we were, who had to carry a horror they couldn't name, a grief that was somehow cleaner and more honest than the sanitized sorrow we'd been permitted before. I drove out to Uncle Frank's house a week later, finding him on his porch, looking older and smaller, as if the confession had physically shrunk him. But his eyes, though red-rimmed and weary, met mine with a directness that had been absent for decades, and we sat for a long time without speaking, the unspoken understanding passing between us that no apology was necessary, only a shared presence in the aftermath. And when he finally did speak, his voice was a dry rasp, telling me about the years of panic every time the phone rang, the dread of family gatherings where he had to retell the drowning story, the way he'd avoid looking at his own scarred hands. And I realized his punishment had been a life sentence, a self-imposed exile within his own family, a burden far heavier than any anger we could have levied upon him. The family ghost had not been Liam's restless spirit, but the living, breathing secret that Uncle Frank had housed within himself, a parasite of guilt that had fed on him for 30 years. And our Ouija board session had been less a seance and more a clumsy, accidental surgery, lancing a festering wound and allowing the poison to finally drain out, leaving us all raw and scarred, but ultimately on a path toward a truer, more honest healing. The reunion would happen again next year, as it always did, but the atmosphere would be different, the ghost of the drowning laid to rest, replaced by the complicated, painful, but real memory of a boy who died in a fire. His name no longer a whispered taboo, but a catalyst for stories that were true, stories that included his laughter, his recklessness, and the tragic, fiery end that was his reality. And I understood now that the most profound horrors are not the things that go bump in the night, but the silent, corrosive secrets we keep in the daylight, the lies we tell to protect the ones we love that end up poisoning us all, and that the only way to truly lay any ghost to rest is to finally, courageously, speak its name aloud in the truth. The process of reintegrating this new, brutal truth into the fabric of my daily existence was less like adding a new thread and more like unraveling the entire tapestry and starting the weave again from the very beginning, each familiar memory and long-held assumption needing to be held up to the light of the fire and examined for its authenticity. And I found myself, in quiet moments, waiting for the kettle to boil, stuck in traffic, revisiting seemingly insignificant moments from my past and watching them transform, like one of those trick drawings where the vase suddenly becomes two faces, the entire emotional context shifting with a nauseating lurch. I remembered my mother's pronounced fear of me swimming in lakes, a fear I'd always attributed to Liam's drowning, but now I saw it for what it was, a desperate, subconscious reinforcement of the lie, a redirecting of the true terror she felt every time she saw a lit match or a spark from a fireplace. A terror she could never explain because its origin story was classified, a state secret within our own family. I thought of my father's uncharacteristic silence whenever the subject of Liam came up, a silence I'd mistaken for a depth of grief too profound for words, but now understood as the grim duty of a co-conspirator, a man helping his brother uphold a terrible, necessary fiction, and the weight of that complicity, carried by so many of the adults I'd trusted implicitly as a child, felt like a second betrayal, not out of malice, but out of a love so flawed and human it chose a kinder monster over a real one. The anger, when it finally came, was a quiet, slow-burning thing, not directed at Uncle Frank, whose agony was its own punishment, but at the situation itself, at the brutal choice he was forced to make and the decades of collateral damage it inflicted, the way this single catastrophic event had sent ripples of dysfunction through all our lives, shaping phobias and relationships in ways we were only just beginning to comprehend. My brother Mark, always the closed-off one, finally admitted his own struggle with pyrophobia was so severe he couldn't even light a pilot light on his stove, a fact he'd hidden behind a facade of incompetence, and the realization that this shared secret had kept us from supporting each other, had instead forced us into isolated cells of private fear, was perhaps the most painful revelation of all. the true poison of the secret being the isolation it bred. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of communication opened up among us, a series of hesitant, then increasingly confident, conversations that started with, "Do you remember?" And instead of ending with the old, scripted conclusion of the drowning, now ventured into the uncharted, terrifying territory of the fire, sharing our fragmented pieces of the true event like archaeologists assembling a pot from broken shards, each person's memory providing a crucial detail: the pattern on the tent, the brand of soda we'd been drinking, the song that was playing on a transistor radio moments before, that helped reconstruct the actual night, not to morbidly dwell, but to finally, after 30 years, give the event its proper shape and burial. We were, in a sense, holding a belated funeral for the truth, and in doing so, we were finally allowing Liam to die his real death, freeing him from the cold, watery grave of the lie, and letting him rest in the peace of what actually happened, a tragedy of accident and panic, not of neglectful swimming. And with this act, the ghost that had haunted our family, the one we thought was Liam, began to truly fade, because it had never been him at all, but the gaping, silent wound of the story we weren't allowed to tell. The haunting was over, replaced by the sober, unglamorous work of grief, a grief that was heavier and more complex because it was real. And as I looked at my family now, I saw not a group haunted by a ghost, but a group of survivors of a shared trauma, finally able to speak its name and, in doing so, finally able to begin to heal not from a story, but from the truth. And I knew that while the scars would always remain, they would no longer be secrets festering in the dark, but marks of survival, worn openly, a testament to the fire we had all, in our own ways, endured. The culmination of this painful, necessary exhumation of the past arrived not with a dramatic climax, but with a simple, quiet decision made collectively over a series of phone calls and text messages that felt more sacred than any planned ceremony we could have organized. A consensus that we needed to go back, not to the old Miller's Pond campground, which had been sold and developed into a strip mall years ago, a fact that now seemed symbolically appropriate, the site of our lie paved over by commerce, but to a place that held the essence of Liam before the fire, a small, secluded stretch of riverbank deep in the state park where we'd gone for picnics when we were all very young, a place where the memory of his laughter wasn't yet tainted by tragedy. We gathered there on a crisp Saturday morning, just the cousins who had been there that night, our own children left with spouses, this pilgrimage being for the wounded children we had been, and the air was thick with a nervous solemnity as we trudged along the familiar path, the scent of damp earth and pine needles stirring a deeper, purer layer of memories of chasing frogs and skipping stones, of Liam daring us to swing on an old rope swing over the river, his whoop of triumph echoing. In the canopy, we didn't build a fire, the very idea now anathema to us, a silent agreement that needed no discussion, but we sat in a circle on a large, sun-warmed rock that overlooked the flowing water, and for a long time, we just listened to the sounds of the forest, the chittering of squirrels and the gentle rush of the river, sounds that had been there before our family's tragedy and would be there long after. A humbling perspective that slowly eased the tightness in my chest. It was Sarah who spoke first, her voice soft but clear, not telling the story of the fire, but telling a story about Liam that we'd all forgotten, about the time he'd secretly collected all the tadpoles from a drying puddle and transferred them to the river, his small face screwed up in concentration as he carefully cupped the wriggling black dots in his hands. A story of innate kindness. And then Mark spoke, laughing through tears about the time Liam had tried to build a raft out of fallen branches and it had sunk immediately, leaving him sputtering and indignant in the waist-deep water. And one by one, we offered up these little gems, these untainted memories that the monolithic tragedy of his death had overshadowed for 3 decades, each story a gentle rebellion against the fiery end, a reclamation of the boy he was before he became a ghost. We were not there to mourn the drowning victim or the fire victim. We were there to remember the tadpole-saving, raft-building, loud-laughing boy. And in doing so, we were finally separating the memory of his life from the trauma of his death. A psychological feat, that had been impossible while the secret festered. As the sun began to dip, casting long, golden fingers through the trees, I felt a sense of peace settle over our group, a quiet closure that was more profound than any spirit's farewell could ever be. And I understood that the Ouija board had not been wrong that night at the reunion. It had been tragically, brilliantly right, but we had misinterpreted its message entirely. It wasn't Liam saying fire camped Liam. From beyond the grave, it was our own buried collective consciousness, the truth itself, using the only tool available to it, a silly board game, to finally punch its way through the layers of lies and time, to scream its name into the room and force us to listen. The ghost we laid to rest that day by the river wasn't Liam. It was the secret, and as we walked back to our cars in the gathering twilight, the path seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe, and I knew that our family's haunting was truly over, replaced by the bittersweet, enduring work of memory, a memory that was now, finally and forever, true. The return to normalcy after our pilgrimage to the riverbank was not a return at all, but an arrival at a new state of being. A life after the haunting where the world looked the same, but felt fundamentally different. The colors a shade more vivid, the silences between people less fraught with unspoken history, and the ghost of Liam, or rather the ghost of the lie about Liam, had finally, truly departed, leaving behind not a void but a space filled with a clean, if aching, truth. I found I could now look at old family photographs, the ones with Liam's face beaming from the edges, without that familiar pang of sorrow mixed with a strange, unplaceable anxiety. The sorrow remained, a rightful grief for a life cut short, but the anxiety had vanished, because the story behind the photograph was now aligned with reality, and the cognitive dissonance that had hummed in the background of my life for 30 years had fallen silent. I even mustered the courage to visit Uncle Frank again, this time with my daughter in tow, and the visit was devoid of the heavy, tragic weight of the previous one, replaced by a simple, quiet warmth as he showed her his garden, his scarred hands gently cupping a tomato as he explained how to tell when it was ripe, and I watched my daughter, completely unaware of the history those hands held, listening with rapt attention. And in that moment I saw the true redemption of Frank's sacrifice, not in the perpetuation of the lie, but in the fact that he had survived to offer this simple, gentle moment to a new generation, a generation that would know the true story when the time was right, a story not of a ghost, but of a great-uncle's immense, flawed, and ultimately redeemed love. The family group chat, once a medium for logistical plans and polite birthday wishes, now occasionally buzzes with a shared memory of Liam, a funny anecdote or a fond recollection that pops up unexpectedly. And these messages are no longer met with a somber, respectful silence, but with a cascade of laughing emojis and addendum stories, a digital wake that celebrates the boy he was rather than mourning the myth he became. The Ouija board, I should mention, was quietly disposed of, not out of fear but out of a profound respect for its accidental power, its role as the unwitting key that unlocked our prison of silence. And I sometimes think of it in a landfill, buried under tons of other discarded truths and trivialities, its work complete. The profound, chilling horror of that night at the reunion has softened with time, not faded, but integrated, becoming a part of my story rather than a terrifying aberration. And I understand now that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones under the bed, but the secrets we bury in the dark corners of our families, secrets that grow in the silence and feed on our fear of the truth. And the only way to defeat them is to drag them, kicking and screaming, into the light, no matter how painful the exposure may be. Our family reunion is next month, and for the first time in 3 decades, I feel not a sense of dread or a passive obligation, but a genuine, quiet anticipation, a desire to be with the people who share this specific, mended fracture in the timeline of our lives, to look at their faces and see not fellow bearers of a grim secret, but fellow survivors, and to know that the stories we will tell, whether of the present or the past, will be built on the solid, unshakable, and finally liberated ground of truth. The anticipation for the reunion bloomed not as a nervous dread, but as a quiet, solid certainty, a feeling of returning to a home whose foundation had been recently repaired, the cracks in the plaster still visible, but the structure itself sounder than it had ever been. And when the day arrived, the atmosphere at Aunt Carol's Victorian was strikingly different, the air lighter, the laughter easier, the hugs lasting a beat longer, infused with a new, unspoken understanding that bound us together, more tightly than the shared secret ever had. We did not speak of the Ouija board or the fire directly. There was no need, its truth now woven into the fabric of us, a thread of sober reality in the colorful tapestry of family life. But its absence was palpable, the ghost of the lie having vacated the premises, leaving room for Liam's true spirit to finally be present, not as a specter to be feared or a tragedy to be whispered about, but as a memory to be cherished. Uncle Frank, though still carrying the years of his burden in the stoop of his shoulders, moved through the crowd with a new lightness, his smile reaching his eyes for the first time I could remember. And at one point I saw him surrounded by a group of our children, not his own grandchildren, but a circle of young, curious faces. And he was telling them a story, not the old, sanctioned one, but a true one, about a boy who was brave and sometimes reckless, who loved tadpoles and building rafts. And I felt a lump form in my throat at the sight, the circle now unbroken, the story finally flowing freely from one generation to the next, sanitized of its horrific end but rich with the truth of his life. Later, as the sun set and someone strummed a guitar on the porch, I sat with Sarah and Mark on the same porch swing, where we'd huddled as terrified children after the fabricated drowning story was first told to us. And we talked not of the past, but of the future, of plans for holidays and our kids' schools. The conversation ordinary yet profound in its normalcy, the weight of the unsaid finally lifted from our shoulders. Driving home that night, the road stretching out before me under a canopy of stars, I realized that the horror story had ended and a different, more human story had begun. A story not about the things that haunt us from the grave, but about the resilience of the human heart to confront its deepest fears, to tear down the monuments it built to its own pain, and to choose, day after day, to build something new upon the ruins of the truth. The ghost is gone, and in its place is something far more powerful and enduring. A family, scarred and imperfect, but finally, blessedly free.